take you to the place inside your mind where thoughts divide and mysteries unwind. Join us every Monday evening right here on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time. And you will catch the Fenton Perspective with our great host, Lorian Fenton. Come listen in as she shares her amazing stories from the past to present, along with all of her guest secrets to the future. That's the Fenton Perspective every Monday evening right here from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time, only on Revolution Radio. Oh, and you don't need to expect us. We're already here.
Extendivite really works. Just listen to what some people have to say.
Several years ago, I was developing a very severe situation. I called it my flippy heart. It was doing not good things, and I did not want to go to a medical doctor because I just knew they would give me a cover-up pill. I didn't want to get onto that sort of thing at all. When I learned it was garlic and cayenne, and cayenne is a healer. It is a wonderful herb. I said, I think I'm onto something here. I'll tell you, I wouldn't be without it. It did wonderful things for me.
Extendivite is only $69.95 for a 2-month supply of either capsules or liquid. Call now. That's 1-877-928-8822 or visit heartdrop.com.
Extend your life with Extendivite.
The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Aloha, everybody, and welcome to Stargate to the Cosmos on Revolution Radio, and I'm your host, Janet Carol Lessin, with my co-host, Dr. Sasha Lessin. Our producer is Thomas Becker, and this is Revolution Radio, Stargate to the Cosmos. And our guests today are Charles H. Rack and Andrew D. Basiago. Before I pull our guests onto the show, I'd like to bring on my co-host, Dr. Sasha Lessin. Are you there, sweetheart? Sound check. And what would you like to say
yes,
about
I
today's
am.
show?
Does my sound check out, honey?
You
Can
sound
hear me well?
pretty good.
Excellent.
Well,
So
yeah,
we're going to have a hot show. Let's stop this stuff and get into what we've got to learn, because we're going to hear some amazing stuff.
I forgot to do a quick intro and let you guess, so back up, rewind. Okay. So first of all, we're going to have Andrew D. Basiago. He's a lawyer, writer, former U.S. chrononaut, former U.S. astronaut. In 2016, he ran for president, the first major figure in the truth movement to seek the presidency. In this interview, in this show today, he's going to reveal for the first time his abduction by aliens at Lac Rapide. Don't know how to pronounce it, in Quebec in 1972. And I want to tell you a little bit about our, let me scroll down. Where is my description? Oh, okay. I don't have a bio on Charles. I just have a little bit about the Allagash Waterway and the, it's a series of lakes and canals in the breathtaking mountains of Maine. And this lovely area is the site of one of the most discussed and best documented alien abduction cases on record, and a dramatized version was featured in Unsolved Mysteries television show. It's called the Allagash Abduction, and it involved multiple witnesses, and there were 4 people, twin brothers Jack and Jim Weiner, along with their friends Chuck Raz and Charlie Foltz, and we're going to have Chuck Rack, and Charlie Foltz. And Chuck's going to have to tell you about himself, because I don't really have a bio. But, and he's going to talk about this instance, and the first part of the show is going to be Chuck talking. Okay, sorry, I forgot to get your bio, but I'll get that from you later, Chuck. Chuck, you'll have to tell everybody about yourself. I know that you are an artist, and you do these, what do they call those, the cartoons about people, caricatures, right? So, Chuck,
That's
welcome
right.
to the show.
Thank you.
Hi. Go ahead. Take it away.
Hi.
Tell us about yourself, and then tell us what happened to you. And then we're going to listen.
Okay. I was born and raised in the Boston area, a suburb called Newton. We had a summer place on Cape Cod. My father was a psychiatrist, my mother a language therapist. So I had a comfortable upbringing and developed a love for the outdoors because we had lived on a lake on Cape Cod. So I was very familiar with the wilderness and natural scenery, and that has perked my attention to traveling around New England and to going mountain climbing, and the Allagash Wilderness Waterway, which I had done once before with another friend named Earl Murphy in a canoe, and it took us a couple of weeks. And I got interested in inviting some other people up to the Allagash, namely Jack Weiner, whom I befriended in art school. We had adjoining cages, and I asked him to go up to the Allagash with me, and he invited his twin brother Jim and another man named Gary, who backed out at the last moment, and he was replaced by a man named Charlie Foltz. So the four of us decided to go up to the Allagash country and rent some canoes from an outfit on Shin Pond up in northern Maine, and we were flown into the Allagash Wilderness Waterway on float planes on two different trips. We disembarked from the float planes and paddled to the nearby campsite to register for our trip, and we were met by a forest ranger and registered, and we started the trip the next day by going northbound, which is the way the Allagash Wilderness Waterway works. It just flows north through a system of interlocking lakes and a river system called the Allagash itself until it reaches the Canadian border of New Brunswick. And that was our route. It was about 125 miles, and it took us probably 9 days to do it. We started out doing the lake system first. We did against the wind, and it was a northerly wind when we started out, and we reached the second lake in that series, which was Chamberlain Lake. And while there, at sundown, we saw a bright light in the eastern sky. It had a reddish tinge to it. It was very prominent, and I thought maybe it was Mars. So I called attention to it. Some of the other campers looked at it, and one of them said, "No, that can't be Mars. It shouldn't be visible now. It's something else." And about when he said that, the light blinked out to a sliver, and it was gone. And 2 nights later, we were camped on the third lake of the series. It was called, I can't remember the name of it now. It was a while ago. Anyway, we built up a big bonfire on the beach, and we set it ablaze. I chopped the wood for it. I sawed it with my Swedish handsaw, and it was all driftwood that we'd found on the beach. And we made the bonfire to last for a little bit so we could find our way back to the campsite because it was getting dark. And we went out onto the water to do some night fishing. And we dropped our lines in the water, and the two people who had been fishing earlier in the day, namely Jim Weiner and I, simply sat out and let Charlie and Jack do the fishing. But we were all getting bitten by mosquitoes. It was quite dark at this point, and we could see the bonfire glowing on the beach. And we were getting bitten, so we decided to head back to shore after not catching any fish. And we were on our way when I had this eerie sensation that there was something staring at us. And I've heard it said from a woman when I told her this story. She said, "Oh, that's the feeling I get when some guy is looking at my rear end." So it was a feeling of being observed and watched. So I turned over towards the object, and I called attention to it. I said, "Hey, guys, that's a hell of a case of swamp gas, don't you think?" And everyone looked at it, and it was a bright globe of light. It was circular. It was roiling. It had a gyroscopic motion to it. It was around the polar and equatorial sides of the object, a kind of a pulsation of energy. It changed the entire globe of light from red to green to yellow-white. At that point, we just couldn't take our eyes off it, and we were very excited, and I was certainly very impressed with it. And I sat there with a paddle in my lap. I was in the back of the canoe. The others were ahead of me, and we were all staring at it. And Charlie, who knew some Morse code, grabbed his flashlight, and he signaled it with an SOS pulsation to indicate we're here. And that's when the object itself quivered and sent a cone-shaped beam of light, bluish in color and quite dull. And it sent this cone-shaped beam of light down onto the water, which was like glass at that point in the evening. And we could see all these reflections in the glass. It started to move towards us, and that's when the twins panicked. And I thought, oh no, they're panicking, and we're not going to find out what this thing is, because I really thought we had a front row seat in observing what this thing was going to do and what it was. But they panicked, and as soon as they panicked, they turned their heads away from the object and started paddling for shore. The twins with their hands and Charlie with his paddle. I sat there and I just kept staring at the thing with the paddle in my lap. And as I did so, the thing moved from a full moon to a crescent moon, and the beam of light moved up towards the sky ahead of it, and it shone on a lenticular-shaped cloud at first, and then went behind a second lenticular cloud. And for the audience, I want to say, being an amateur meteorologist, this was the forerunner of a warm front. As I said, we'd had a stiff headwind, but it changed on the day we had reached this particular lake and had become calm. This is what happens when a warm front first starts advancing on an area, and then the wind starts to turn into the south. So that's what the process was. The lenticular clouds are first, or altostratus clouds at an elevation of about 17,000 feet. So it went behind the second lenticular cloud, and then it reemerged and did a stair-step flutter towards the south. And as it did so, it became further and further away from us and disappeared over Mount Katahdin, which is the tallest mountain in Maine, which at that point must have been a few miles away. And then it was gone. And then we reached the shore, pulled up the canoes, returned to the fire, which was by now much lower, and we discussed the incident. And at one point, Charlie said, "You want me to put more wood on the fire?" And we all decided, well, no thanks, we're just going to turn in, which we did. And it was just a bunch of embers. So we just turned in, and that was it. That was what I remember.
Alrighty. Andrew. Hi, welcome, Andrew Basiago. Say hi to our audience. And
hi,
would you
Janet.
like to start the asking questions and do your part now, and then we'll start connecting the dots. Go ahead. Hi, Andrew.
Okay, well, I was born in September of 1961, and I'm the youngest of a family of 7, 5 children. And I was struck by an abduction that I had at Lac Rapide, which of course means rapid lake in French, in the Wurundjeri National Park in Quebec, Canada, that took place in August of 1972. I was struck by a number of the similarities of that particular abduction experience that I had with the Allagash 4, and it's a pleasure to appear with Chuck to discuss and maybe identify some of the similarities. But I was 10 years old. I would become 11 that September, so I was still 10, and I had just won Best Artist of my 5th grade class at Mount View Road School in Morris Plains, New Jersey. And I had also won an art contest sponsored by my church, which was Notre Dame of Mount Carmel Catholic Church in Cedar Knolls, New Jersey. And we had been camping and fishing as a family very close to the Allagash Reservoir for years. In fact, I spent a lot of my summers on Moosehead Lake, Maine, Moose Lake, Maguntic, and Rangeley Lake, Maine, although I don't think I was ever on the Allagash Reservoir. But in the 1940s, my father, Raymond, who was an engineer for the Ralph M. Parsons Company in New York City, in the 40s he had traveled to Lac Rapide and lived really in a remote location that we ultimately found when we went there in 1972. And it was on that trip in summer of 72 that we had incredible fishing. We had the best fishing we ever had as a family. We would cut the engine of our boat and drift into a bay, and we would sometimes have every line of everybody in the boat would have a northern pike or a walleye pike on it at the same time. So this was a very fortuitous camping trip, to say the least. So on the last night of the trip, and by the way, another similarity I found with Chuck's story is that 2 of my siblings were twins, a fraternal twinning of my eldest brother and his younger sister. So my group of 5 siblings and I, 4 siblings and I, included twins. And as I mentioned, I had just been cited both in public school and in parochial school or Sunday school for my artistic ability, which I find very synchronous with the 4 artists, 2 of them being twins involved in the Allagash case. And of course, Lac Rapide is about 400 miles across the Canadian border, so probably about 500 miles from the Allagash Reservoir, not that far away. And I'm absolutely certain that this took place in August of 1972, about 4 years earlier than their case. But we were sitting in a family in a fire on the shore of Lac Rapide, right next to our tents, in a kind of an oval pattern, so that the thin side of the oval faced the southern approach to Lac Rapide, which is a very long lake that goes through almost multiple chained lakes, just like the Allagash Reservoir, another similarity. And it was about 10 p.m. on our last day of camping, and we were just sort of sitting there and reminiscing what an incredible fishing trip and camping trip it was. I really can't believe how far into the wilderness my father took us, because it was a full 50 miles on gravel road once we got into the Vrundere National Park in Quebec, Canada, before we got to Lac Rapide. I think if any of us had had a medical problem, there would have been a problem, because there were no hospitals around or anything. So we were all sitting there, all 7 of us, around the campfire, when a very brilliant light suddenly appeared several miles up the lake, north, up the center of Lac Rapide. And we asked each other what it was, and some of us suggested that it was a helicopter. So my eldest sister, who was then 15 years old, stood up, and she trained her flashlight on the object, just like occurred in the Allagash abduction. And my dad, who was a trained observer, having been brought into the alien project in October of 1952, when he was ordered by the U.S. Air Force to report. He'd been working at Okanite in Paramus, New Jersey, as an engineer, and he was ordered by a colonel for the U.S. Air Force to report to Curtis Wright that next Monday to work on the metal alloy by which the ramjet would be built. The ramjet was a high-performance jet that drew air into a foil in front of it and spit it out the back that was hoped to be fast enough to chase the UFOs out of our atmosphere after the famous July 1952 overflight of our nation's capital, in which 9 flying saucers, UFOs, extraterrestrial craft, clocked at traveling 7,000 miles per hour by the Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, hovered over our Capitol building in Washington, D.C., as was reported at the time by the New York Times and the Washington Post on their front page. And so my father was a trained observer not only of domestic and foreign aircraft, but of extraterrestrial craft. He was literally working on America's response to them, which included the ability to teleport around the sky. And that's how he and I got brought into Project Pegasus in the 1960s, the late 1960s. So when my sister stood up around the campfire and trained her flashlight on this very bright object, and we started talking among ourselves whether it was a helicopter or not, my dad suddenly jumped up, pulled the helicopter, or excuse me, the flashlight out of my sister's hand and said, "Give me that flashlight." He then turned off the flashlight and began kicking sand into the fire to put it out. When he did, the object kept on getting closer and closer to our side of the lake. And we said, "That's not a helicopter, that's a flying saucer." And I had been bathing down in Lac Rapide every morning, and I was a good swimmer at that age. I could go out and float and wash and take my morning wash with my morning bath, as it were, with a bar of ivory soap that would float in the water. So I was very accustomed to the sandy approach to the lake down below our campsite. And I began running down towards this lenticular craft. And it was clearly not a helicopter. It was clearly a disc-shaped craft. And we were going, "My God, it's not a helicopter, it's a flying saucer." And when I did, my dad yelled, "Andy, get back here." And as the craft drew closer and closer to the shore, I ran back to join my family. But as a result, when the craft landed about 2 campsites up elevation on the shore of Lac Rapide, immediately next to us, a lenticular craft that was about 24 feet wide, I would estimate. It really wasn't that big. I was halfway between my 6 family members and the craft because I was running back to the fire at my dad's instruction. And I was a good kid, and I did what my father told me. And it was quite startling to see this thing coming towards us. So as I ran up to join my family on the right side of the oval array of them sitting around the campfire, most of them now standing, perhaps my mother was still sitting, the craft came and made, you usually hear that UFOs don't make any noise, but this thing made a distinctive noise as it came in towards us. It was sort of like it was operating some kind of gyroscopic mechanism to slow up. And it, as I said, it actually landed a couple of campsites, and they were unoccupied because it was the end of the fishing season. It was late August, and most of the families that had been staying on Lac Rapide had left. So the campsites next to us were vacant. And it was just really a sandy beach more than anything else. And as the UFO landed, I would estimate about maybe 40 feet from our fire on the campsite, and 2 campsites next to ours, I ran towards it, but then I heard my father call to me again, and I looked back, and first my 2 sisters, and then my 2 brothers, and then my mother, and then my father. They were all arrayed in a line towards the UFO from our fire, but they were frozen. Not frozen with fear, but literally frozen. In other words, of the 7 of us, having run towards the beach and then run back to the fire, I was the only one of the 7 of us who was still mobile. And I turned around and I ran the additional 20 feet after I saw that all 6 of my family members, my immediate family members, were literally frozen, as if the ETs had some way of affecting their forward movement and just freezing them in place. I turned around and I slowly walked the extra 20 feet or so to the craft. And as I did, the top seam of the craft split open, and there were 4 tall grays sitting 2 abreast, sitting towards each other. In other words, there was an array of 4 seats inside the craft with 2 ETs on one side and 2 ETs on the other side, and I'm walking towards it, thinking, God, what am I going to do now? My family is frozen, and these ETs are opening their ship. And by then, the noise they were making had subsided, and the craft was clearly not flying anymore and had turned off and was on the beach there. So I slowly walked towards them.
Andy,
and
I want to stop you there to kind of put a little teaser here, okay? Before you go and have contact, I want to go back and get what happened to Chuck, okay? So we go back and forth. Because we have a little cliffhanger here, okay?
Okay, Jen, let me just say this. One additional detail, and that is I simply held up my hand, and I said to them, not knowing whether they spoke English, I said, I come in peace. Now, the interesting thing is I recently discussed this abduction with my next eldest brother, and I said, do you remember what I then said to them? And he said, yes, you stuck your right hand in the air and said, I come in peace. So anyway, then they abducted me. So that's how the abduction happened. I literally walked towards their craft.
So we don't want to go into the abduction until we come back from Chuck saying what happened to him. Just pause right there, bookmark that. We'll go into greater detail about what happened. So that's a little cliffhanger for everybody. Sasha, I just want to, are you there, honey? You have anything you want to say? Sasha, you there?
Janet, just let our guest talk, okay?
I want to go back and forth, okay?
I understand. Okay. So you don't need to toss it to me. Go back. Yes.
Okay, Chuck, your turn, because you had similar things going on. So you go back and you're going to bed. You didn't put more wood on the fire. So then what happened?
Well, we went to sleep after after we decided not to put any more wood on the fire, we seemed very calm at this point. Nobody was agitated or excited or anything, and we were relaxed and in the mood to sleep, which we did. So the next day we woke up and continued our journey into the next succeeding lake, and it was a sunny day, and there wasn't much weather action, it seemed, sort of inconclusive. And we ran into a speedboat operated by the ranger that signed us in. And we told him what we had seen the night before. And he said in his thick Maine accent, he said, well, that's really something, fellas. I think I know what you guys saw. There was a grand opening for a hardware store down in Millinocket. And they had a pickup truck with a couple of searchlights going back and forth across the sky. And that's probably what you boys saw. And after he said that, we all realized that Millinocket was about 75 miles away. And we could not have possibly seen that kind of action from the Allagash, the lake where we were. And so obviously he thought we were nuts, and as a lot of people do. So we thanked him and separated, and we went on our way. And we told a lot of these friends we had back in the Boston area about it, and they had a reaction like we're nuts, until Jim Weiner said something to this author named Raymond Fowler, who was an author of UFO books. And he said, well, this is what happened up in northern Maine with my twin brother and a couple of friends. And Ray said, you mean twins? Identical twins? And Jim said, yep. And he said, I want to talk to you. And that's how the investigation about the Allagash story happened. It started with that incident. Ray Fowler put us under hypnosis with a fellow from northern Massachusetts, Salem, where you remember the Salem witch trials of history. Yes. That's the town. That's the town that we were all hypnotically regressed by Tony Constantino, a hypnotic therapist. And I remember Tony had a bad head cold when he downloaded me, and I had a bad head cold the second time. So my hypnosis didn't go very well. I couldn't remember anything exotic. And I just went ahead and said what I've just finished telling you people. Nothing extraordinary, just a sighting. And when Tony got finished downloading everybody else, they came up with stories of abduction on board a UFO, and that I had been the first one taken by this light that engulfed the canoe and levitated us one by one aboard this UFO. And they examined us naked. We were all naked and sitting on a bench. And Ray Fowler wrote a book about it called the Allagash Abductions. And that's how we got to be known in the UFO community. But I don't remember anything about being abducted. I just remember what I told you. I was sitting motionless in the back with the paddle in my lap, and as soon as those guys panicked, the thing took off. But those other witnesses, the twins and Charlie Foltz, took their eyes off the object, yet they were full of testimony about the behavior of the object before, during, and after this panic set in. So that's the way it happened. They had a difference of testimony with me, and I don't remember. Wow. Sorry to tell you that there are some children running back and forth atop the grandstand where I'm camped underneath, and they're making a lot of noise, as children are wont to do.
Shoot. You're outside, okay.
Yes, I had to move under the grandstand because of the wind, the howling winds that take place here were blowing my tent down. So I needed a windbreak, which was underneath. And these are the only children on the fairgrounds. The crowds have not arrived yet, so they're being very noisy.
Okay, so we'll work around it.
So was your consciousness up-leveled by the contact? Did you feel like you'd been changed in any way?
No, I've always been kind of psychic. That I don't remember anything psychic happening from the UFO incident. It's mostly from my father, who was a psychiatrist, and he would probe people's minds, which is what I do when I do my caricatures. I can tell about people immediately, and I incorporate what I feel into the caricatures. And I've always had a very easy time with that and discerning who people are and what they're like. But I don't attribute that to anything that happened on the Allagash. It was just motivated by my love for nature, and also some feelings that the Weiners were very adept at telling stories, and very somewhat psychic and very colorful storytellers. So I thought it was important to get those guys up there and to have an experience, because I really would like, I remember thinking this, that I would love to have had a UFO encounter even before we went up there, and these were the right people to get up there to do it with.
Yeah, you know, when you encountered the in hypnotic work, when you encountered the others, those four, what sense did you get in this, you know, psychic kind of reading that you got of these beings? What did you get?
The beings meaning the twins and Charlie Foltz?
No, I mean the four people in the ship. The four people that were seated in the ship.
Well, there were four of us. It was the twins, Charlie Foltz and I, were. We were the uninvited guests of the aliens, I guess we might say.
There wasn't anybody there, so you don't remember noticing any other beings, just the four of you.
Yes, just Charlie Foltz and the twins. That's all I remember.
So you never got any additional memories back?
No, I didn't get any memories of abductions. No, nothing like that.
So what is the story that they were telling, and do you believe their story? Can you tell us what the story was? And
I don't believe a
word
of it.
What your reactions were?
I don't believe a word of it. I think they are very fantasy prone, which was why I wanted to invite them up there anyway in the first place, because I was very curious about their ability to use the fantasy of their mind to tell stories. We were all in our early 20s, so that's what I was interested in. As people of that age are, you know, we were heavy marijuana smokers at the time. I remember that, and that's nothing that they would admit to. They denied any kind of pot smoking, but certainly we were smoking marijuana every single day of the Allagash trip, right up to shoving off and going out onto the water to do the fishing. So I enjoyed their company and the fantasy-prone stories that they always told, and I just assumed that this was another fantasy-prone story. A little hard for me to swallow, since I recollect that the UFO took off as soon as they panicked, almost as if they scared up a deer. And you know, if you want to go deer hunting, you want to be really careful not to spook the deer. But they spooked the deer.
Okay, so let me just ask you: can you just tell us what they say? Okay, first of all, do you have any idea what that was coming towards you? What do you think it was? What's your hypothesis? Was it a helicopter?
Well, No, it was not anything conventional. It was definitely a UFO. It was unidentified. It was very, very intensely colored in a very gaseous, almost liquid way. It was an energy that went around the pole and the equator of the object in a gyroscopic manner, very energized. So this was very silent as well. It wasn't making any noise at all, and very circular, and went from a full moon to a crescent moon just after those guys panicked. So they told the story to Tony Constantino, the hypnotherapist, that they encountered beings, luminous beings. In fact, Jim started it by having these dreams about being levitated by luminous humanoid beings above his bed after he had had a very bad accident when he fell through a couple of floors touring a house he was considering on buying in Maine. But he got traumatic epilepsy, and as soon as that happened to him, he started having these visions of luminous humanoid beings poking him with needles and levitating him above his bed. So that's how we got into it. That's what brought him to Ray Fowler, and Ray Fowler took it from there.
Now, what year was this Allagash incident? What year was the Allagash?
It was in 1977.
Yeah.
1977. Okay.
Do you hold it at all possible that they may have had experiences that are just as real to them as yours were to you, and that it might be a real experience, or have you decided that they just made it up?
I think they made it up. I think it was a fantasy thing, and they wanted to be pole vaulted into some kind of notoriety. And this was more of their storytelling. They'd had a history of storytelling, starting with this ghostly image that entered their bedroom when they grew up in Pennsylvania, and they liked to tell that story called Harry the Ghost. And some people were fantasy prone. That's what I assumed.
I wanted to just add that I was raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, so I'm from the Northeast, and I encountered these orbs, gaseous sightings. I would take my friends and I'd say, do you want to see these things? And we'd see them all the time. They were bright colors, like orange, red. Some were green, some were blue. They changed and shifted. So that was something that was common in the Northeast. And then, of course, you're aware of like the Betty and Barney Hill. My question is, did they hypnotize them separately? Or did they do them all together in the same room?
We were all hypnotized separately, all separately.
Okay.
At one point, I overheard a conversation between the twins of, should we mention the fact that they had an insignia on their belts? That was a comment. We were cautioned and told not to share information about our hypnosis, but that was one comment they let slip.
Yeah, and I've heard people, so that indicates it might have been a military abduction, if they had one, or there are military factions within the extraterrestrial, they have their own ranking system. Okay, but you don't remember everything, so you think it was a total bouncy. Okay, so Andy, let's go back to you. Do you have more comments before I pass the talking stick back to Andy? Sasha, do you have any more questions or comments?
No, I want to hear Andy. I want to hear Andy now.
Okay, Andy, your turn to.
Well, one thing I know
questions.
is that when the craft was above the water, several miles north of us on Lac Rapide, it had an extremely brilliant searchlight, which I think is also part of the Allagash case. And, it landed up there, and as I said, I looked back at my 6 other family members, and I was the youngest, and I thought, oh, great, they're frozen, and I better turn and confront these beings, because these 4 tall grays were sitting there, seated so that 2 of them were sitting across from each other. And it was not that big of a craft. I mean, I've heard stories of huge crafts, and my father and I saw a huge UFO above Morris Plains, New Jersey in summer of '68. And I had contact with the small grays throughout childhood. But when I walked towards these four beings inside the craft after it sort of split open on the top seam, sort of cantilevered open, and they were sitting there, they were clearly tall grays, and they were very luminous. They looked sort of illuminated. The next thing I know is after I raised my right hand and said, I come in peace, and I don't know how my next eldest brother could have gotten that detail because he was already frozen. So maybe I told him about this after it happened. I don't know. But that was very recently.
He might have been able to, he could have been able to hear. He might have been able to hear even though he couldn't move.
Possibly, or maybe I just talked to him about this, and he came up with that detail, and it really surprised my girlfriend and I because I didn't know how he would have gotten that detail so accurately. So anyway, the next thing I know, they somehow immobilized me so I couldn't move. I don't remember any insignia on their clothing, although they clearly were tall grays, and it seemed like, it's really hard to describe, it seems like when they took me aboard the craft, the inside of the craft got much larger, and I also sensed, I don't know why, that the craft was farther over to the left than it had been. In other words, even farther north than our campsite and the fireplace where all seven of us had been sitting. There just seemed to be some translation geographically. And they put me on a table, a very Spartan medical examining room, and I just flipped out. I just totally panicked. And the tall gray right next to me was clearly a female among the three or four of them who were clearly male. There was a female gray standing next to me who said, "Calm down, we're not going to hurt you," to me telepathically. And I still was just flipping out, and I was struggling and trying to get away. I was trying to get up from the table, and they kept pushing me down. And finally, they put some kind of restraints on me at the ankles and the wrists, and I kind of started breathing heavily and calming down, realizing they were going to do something to me, and there was no point in struggling because they had me fixed to the table. And the only thing I remember that happened is they took out hypodermic needles and injected them into my eyeballs. Now, in 2016, my vision began, after having fairly excellent vision for most of my life, even though it ultimately got corrected when I was in high school. I used to be called Eagle Eye when we would be camping, like in Maine. And it's such a pleasure to be appearing with Chuck because, I mean, like I said, I spent a lot of summers in Maine as a child growing up on the East Coast. And that's why I was so drawn to the Allagash 4 case and the possible similarities with my own experience in Lac Rapide. But anyway, the only thing I remember is they injected hypodermic needles into my eyeballs, and even though I was called Eagle Eye when we would be camping when I was a kid, my vision started to decline when I was in high school and got really bad. I ultimately got shot bottle glasses by the time I was in law school. And in 2016, when I was 55 years old, I started getting floaters in my eyes, striations of blood and of proteins that blocked my retina, and I became legally blind. That's what I was been battling for about the last 2 years. And I've had an operation on each eye known as a vitrectomy, where the vitreous humor is removed to get rid of those floaters to get so that the retina can work at the back of the eye. And I'm going to be getting cataract surgery that was worsened by the surgery and new lenses fairly soon. So I should be fairly able to see. They think they're going to be able to get my vision back to about 20/100. That's 20, colon 100, which with glasses will, if they give me nearsightedness in the lenses, I'll probably be able to get glasses for farsightedness. So I may even be able to drive again, they think. But anyway, and read and write, hopefully. So fingers crossed on that. But I do remember that I was horrified and totally freaked out of my mind as these tall grays stuck hypodermic needles into my eyeballs and said, "Don't worry, these aren't going to hurt you. We're just checking your eyes." And I was screaming bloody murder. The next thing I know, the medical examination ended, and all 7 of us woke up around the campfire, but it was completely out because my father had kicked all that sand into it before I was abducted by the tall grays to put it out so that they wouldn't land their craft in the way that they did. He clearly knew right away that it was not a helicopter and that he had to do that to protect us as a family. So the next morning at 4 o'clock, my father woke us up and we packed our tent and did all the things we did as a family when we were camping, but totally early in the morning, even though he didn't have to report to work right away. And we had time to drive back to New Jersey. He got us up at 4 o'clock, and we struck the tents. We had tents for my parents, my sisters, and then my brothers and I, 3 tents. And we just knocked that whole campsite down in about 20 minutes, put it in our boat, and piled into our station wagon that we used to tow our boat, and he just sped to Morris Plains, New Jersey. I mean, I don't know how far it is from Lac Rapide to Morris Plains, but it's at least 1,000 miles. And during that trip, I was sick as a dog. I had dry heaves from Lac Rapide, 400 miles across the Quebec, U.S. border, to Morris Plains, New Jersey, literally. So that the next morning when I got up, after getting some sleep, we got into our house in New Jersey at 4 o'clock the next day. My father did not stop except to buy gas and some hamburgers along the way. It was like he was racing away from where the ET craft had been and where I had been abducted and where we had landed so closely to this, 24-foot lenticular craft that he was almost compulsive and sped home. And in the process, I was sick, car sick, like every 20 minutes for the whole route. So that the next morning when I woke up and I walked outside into the sunshine in beautiful Morris Plains, New Jersey, where I had been born in Morristown and grew up, I felt like I was going to have a heart attack because I was so depleted from having spent the whole last 24 hours throwing up when we went from 4 a.m. in Canada to 4 a.m. the next day in New Jersey, that I was really spent. And I don't think, however, it was either psychosomatic or actual motion sickness from driving. Because by 10, I no longer had such motion sickness. I had that when I was about, maybe 6, 7, and 8, primarily. I didn't have it when I was real small, and I didn't have it when I was still pre-adolescent. I had it during sort of the middle of that period. I believe it was radiation poisoning from the craft, because I felt horrible when we got up to strike the tents. And when my dad walked with me outside one time as we were driving home, I said, "Dad, something happened last night." And he said, "I know." And I got sick. And in other words, I was reeling from what I think was radiation sickness from their craft, but it was manifesting in what my family thought was just car sickness. And like I said, I had the dry heaves all the way home and was just ready to have a heart attack by the time I woke up the next morning. I was as depleted as any time in my childhood. And in fact, I would say possibly any time in my life. And my life would ultimately take me all over the world as a public speaker when I began sharing my time travel and my Mars visitation experiences as a U.S. chrononaut in DARPA's Project Pegasus beginning in 2004. And then when I began sharing my experiences as a U.S. astronaut in the CIA's Mars Jump Room program, which I did during my college years at UCLA, which I began sharing in 2010. So I've traveled over half the world, from Kelowna, British Columbia in the north to Cordoba, Argentina in the south, and from Orlando, Florida in the east to Kona, Hawaii in the west for the last 10 years and never gotten any air sickness or anything. But I was sick as a dog when we drove home after this abduction the night before at Lac Rapide. So I pretty much...
Andy, if we could ask a question about, as a time traveler, it seems entirely possible to me that you would have seen what was coming down in some way, and that's why you had radiation poisoning, because you had that advanced information. What do you think of that hypothesis?
I don't know if I was that. I was a smart kid. I don't know if I thought radiation sickness at the time. That's kind of a post hoc analysis, but I think it's possible that they had a particularized interest in me, because when DARPA was experimenting with time travel and I was in the thick of it, I was showing up in the Greys, in the area of or dimensions that the Greys operate in. So I think it's possible that the reason I got singled out for that abduction among the 7 in our family was that my father had selected me for Project Pegasus, and they were wondering, well, who is this little boy who's showing up periodically in our, where we travel.
That's our music for the break here. Pause.
Wow.
Stop. Be back
Thank
in
you,
5
Andy.
minutes.
Thank you.
We'll have you back in 5 minutes. See you in 5.
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Wadia will remain a dictatorship. Oh, be quiet. Why are you guys so anti-dictators? Imagine if America was a dictatorship. You could let 1% of the people have all the nation's wealth. You could help your rich friends get richer by cutting their taxes and bailing them out when they gamble and lose. You could ignore the needs of the poor for healthcare and education. Your media would appear free, but would secretly be controlled by one person and his family. You could wiretap phones. You could torture foreign prisoners. You could have rigged elections. You could lie about why you go to war. You could fill your prisons with one particular racial group, and no one would complain. You could use the media to scare the people into supporting policies that are against their interests.
Tune in Monday through Friday, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, for Liberation Nation with Deacon John, where America comes to hear the truth.
I know this is hard for you Americans to imagine, but please try.
Ohio Exopolitics will be on from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern on Studio A. Mark Schneider will have guests on that will discuss many important topics, including the state of the world today. However, much of the show will be dedicated to the writings of Edward Albert Meyer. Let me read a short passage from one of his writings. Love is the highest principle of creation, and through it, everything exists in absolute logic. All of nature in its indescribable splendor is nothing but the love of creation, which is expressed visibly. The love of creation is everywhere, because without it, nothing at all would be able to exist. Please join Mark on Ohio Exopolitics from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern on Studio A.
It is no secret that the so-called mainstream media is best described as controlled propaganda. Countless news stories are either totally ignored or spun with half-truths, and because of this, essential facts and vital information are often compromised. Join Dr. Ott every Friday night on Studio B at 10 p.m. Eastern and learn why The Story Behind the Story was nominated for a Peabody Award in its second year of producing unparalleled broadcasting excellence in 1997. That is, if you really care about learning the truth.
Transcending time and space, let us take you to the place inside your mind where thoughts divide and mysteries unwind. Join us every Monday evening right here on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time. And you will catch the Fenton Perspective with our great host, Lorian Fenton. Come listen in as she shares her amazing stories from the past to present, along with all of her guest secrets to the future. That's the Fenton Perspective every Monday evening right here from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time, only on Revolution Radio. Oh, and you don't need to expect us. We're already here.
Extendivite really works. Just listen to what some people have to say.
Several years ago, I was developing a very severe situation. I called it my flippy heart. It just was doing not good things. And I did not want to go to a medical doctor because I just knew they would give me a cover-up pill. I didn't want to get onto that sort of thing at all. When I learned it was garlic and cayenne, and cayenne is a healer. It is a wonderful herb. I said, I think I'm onto something here. I'll tell you, I wouldn't be without it. It did wonderful things for me.
Extendivite is only $69.95 for a 2-month supply of either capsules or liquid. Call now. That's 1-877-928-8822 or visit heartdrop.com.
Extend your life with Extendivite.
The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Aloha and welcome back to Stargate to the Cosmos on Revolution Radio at revolution.radio. And I'm your host, Janet Lessin, with Dr. Sasha Alex Lessin, my co-host, producer Thomas Becker, and our guests are Charles H. Rack and Andrew D. Basiago. And we're talking about the Allagash Abduction and another experience that Andrew had in the same vicinity, approximately the same time. But before we get back to our show, I'd like to remind everybody to please go over to that donation button on revolution.radio and make your donation, because we really need your donation. It helps us bring you these types of shows. And we don't know where we are in our fundraising because Hawk is still in the hospital, so send him prayers and meditation and good vibes for his quick recovery. Dr. Sasha, are you there?
Yes, I am. And we've got to a really interesting part in the last hour where we have Chuck, who's got a very scientific, objective set of recollections, and then we have these people that may be prevaricating, lying, making up stuff to become famous, and that was Chuck's hypothesis. And then we've got me, which is, I find it really interesting when people deliberately make up stuff. Where is the up that they make it from? what do they come up with? And as Sigmund Freud said, the neurotic act always contains within it the truth it's meant to conceal. And so I like lies. I can do a lot with them. So I'm interested in what these guys said.
Right. Okay. So we'll come back. I guess Andy will go backward. So let's go back to Chuck. And so Chuck, so you have your story. You don't remember anything. A lot of times these abduction people, they don't remember. Both the military and the extraterrestrials tend to white minds. They have many reasons for doing it. Sometimes they want to protect the abductee from trauma because these experiences are very traumatic. Sometimes they want to keep the secret. They don't want someone to let out the information about their, their projects or the military bases or whatever. So you had this experience where you're being hypnotized and they're being hypnotized and everybody's hypnotized separately and they're coming up with stories and they have Ray Fowler, who is pretty well known and pretty, I guess he's pretty scientific. He wrote a series of many books back in the 70s and I don't know the time frame. I didn't have a chance to look that up. So what were you thinking when these stories were emerging? So you're saying you thought it was total fabrication. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but back to you, Chuck. What would you like our listeners to know about your experience and what you thought, what you saw? Back to you.
You mentioned I have a very interesting Ray Fowler story. Because I've been telling what I consider to be the truth, he doesn't want anything to do with me, doesn't want me to be interviewed and doesn't want to participate, having me along and so forth, because I don't tell a very sexy story. I just tell what I remember. And an interesting story about Ray Fowler is 2 years before the Allagash incident occurred. I was driving down a road in early December with my girlfriend in her car after doing some Christmas shopping in some town in eastern Vermont. So we were heading back to where my mother had a house in southern Vermont in a place called Townsend. And the road to get there would have been blocked off in any kind of snow situation until springtime. It was a dirt road, and there weren't any houses on it. And so it was just left abandoned for the winter to let the snow block it. So knowing this, it had started snowing a little bit earlier that day, and not a lot, but a few inches. And I knew that we could still get through this particular remote road to take this shortcut back to Townsend, Vermont. Well, my girlfriend and I, her name was Cheryl, were having a discussion about possible career choices on the drive. And the reason I took this road was because it was so beautiful, just beautiful, with the snow clinging to every branch. Anyway, we reached a point somewhere along the road when Cheryl was telling me, I could never be a nurse. And I said, why not? And she said, because I couldn't stand the sight of blood. And as soon as she said that, we rounded a corner and there was a man staggering down the road covered with blood from his head and shoulders. And I quickly stopped for him because I knew that the direction he was going in would have been the wrong direction to try to get any kind of help. So I picked him up, and Cheryl was upset that I took him into the car with all the blood and everything. But I knew there was a hospital in the direction we were traveling. And he seemed to be very scared and very somnambulistic, like he was about to faint. He said he felt like he was going to faint. And so I decided to try to keep him talking about what he was doing there. And he said he was visiting the area. He was told to go there by his friend Ray Fowler to investigate a UFO landing in Townsend, Vermont, where there was this semicircular disc-shaped melted place in the snow where the snow did not accumulate. and he took soil samples because it was December before there was frozen ground, and put them in his car. And just about then we passed by his car smashed up against a tree. So he could not make the turn and smashed into the tree. So we took him a few miles to the hospital and admitted him there, and I called his wife and told her what happened. And this man's name was John Melody. He was the investigator on the scene. So he sent me a letter about 6 months later saying that his injuries were more severe than they originally thought at the hospital, which was a very small, tiny rural hospital. It was not a big city hospital at all. But it was the only place that I thought where he could get some help for his injuries. And so that was that. He was sent by Ray Fowler. And anyway, that Ray, then it turned out that Ray didn't want me anywhere near the investigation, and said he would not participate in any investigation with which I was included. So I just thought I'd pass that along as an interesting side note. There's some sort of happenstance or coincidence that happened in the Allagash incident itself, sort of a psychic thing, that this happened before the Allagash incident.
Wow, interesting. It says in the article that I have here about the Allagash incident that everybody was hypnotized and at one point given lie detector tests. So all four of you passed the lie detector test, right? Even though you don't.
Well, I remember that. Yeah, it was
story.
in New York City at a hotel, and we all had to get up in the middle of the night to take these lie detector tests on very little food. There was no food available, and I remember thinking how hungry I was during that. But I guess we passed the test because we were about to appear on the Joan Rivers show about the incidents.
Okay. Do you have any questions before I go back to Andy? Do you have any questions for Andy about his experience?
No, I assume he's telling the truth, and that he's a very colorful speaker, so I enjoy listening to him.
Okay. So, do you have anything else you want to say before I pass the talking stick back to Andy?
Okay.
Anything else you want to say? Okay.
Take it away, Andy.
Okay, Andy, back to you. Do you have any questions for Chuck before we go?
No, but I do want to make a point that I think may be germane to Chuck's experience. I certainly respect his analysis or his position on what happened with the Allagash Four. That's their experience, and I respect what the four of them respectively have said that I've been able to learn. I'm not an expert on their case by any means, but I do want to address several issues that relate to my own exploration of my ET contact experiences and my father's work on the ET project. And that is, there's clearly a pattern of duality and of discrepant experience among common experiencers. So, for example, I once spoke with Don Ecker of UFO Magazine, who described hunting in Ohio when he was growing up in the 1960s, and he saw a UFO in the sky and his two friends didn't. Now, one of my abductions took place on Columbus Day of 1967. I was in the first grade, and my next eldest brother was in the second grade and was much bigger than me because he was growing up quicker, and taller and broader shoulders and faster. And we skipped down. It was very blustery weather. It's October in New Jersey, Columbus Day. And we skipped down the path through the woods between our neighborhood and our school ground. And we went around Mount View Road School, which was our elementary school in Morris Plains, New Jersey. And at the back of the school, there were glacial tailings that were being flattened out into what would become a baseball diamond and a soccer field. And rye grass was growing at the bottom of the hill, right before the field was being terra-shaped into existence, essentially. And my brother said to me, let's go down and talk to that guy. And I followed after him about 20 paces behind him. And when I reached him, he was running to the right away from this being down in the tall grass, and he yelled over his shoulder, "It's not a kid, and it's not a human." He then ran up the hill of the school grounds to complete the circle around the school, and I looked at this gray E.T. in front of me. He looked quite elderly with a very wizened, wrinkled face. And he said to me telepathically, "Why is your brother frightened?" And I didn't stop to answer his question. I ran after my older brother, one of my older brothers. And the next thing I know, we were waking up aboard, again, a small E.T. craft, and a gray E.T. was floating down, and he fed us this fruit that made no sense according to fruit on Earth. It was they were all shaped like a conventional fruit, but it was like a purple orange, an orange banana, a yellow pear. In other words, well, that would be normal, but the colors didn't correspond to the shapes of the fruits. And the gray asked us to try the fruit, and it was like dried fruit or almost like a candy, and it produced euphoria. Now, they then dropped us off, and we walked over to the macadam footpath that went around our elementary school, and I said, and the ship took off, and I'm using this as an example of the duality issue that I think may be at the heart of the discrepancy between what the Allagash Four either experienced or what they remember experiencing. Because I turned to my brother and said, I don't want to give his name, but I said, something happened back there. And he said, shut up. And I said, no, brother, something just happened back there. Let's go back there and see what happened. And he said, no, it didn't. And then when we were walking home, we were halfway through the pathway up to our house, up to our development. And I stopped him again. I said, no, brother, let's go back. Something happened back there. We were picked up by aliens. And he said, shut up. No, it didn't. Then when we reached our family's house, we went behind the house and we began making, like we were making snow angels like kids do in the snow when they move their arms and legs back and forth to make a snow angel in the snow. And we started doing that in these oak leaves that we had raked with my dad that weekend that were in a pile right behind our house because we hadn't disposed of them yet. And when we did, a red and black helicopter with 2 U.S. Air Force pilots, one piloting the helicopter and one in an observation bubble on the right side of the helicopter, virtually landed on our house. And we spent about 20 minutes jabbering away, telling my dad about that when he got home from work. My mother, that brother, and myself, my 3 older siblings were at a band practice that evening. And yet neither my mother nor my brother remembered that 10, 20, 30 years later when I discussed it with them, at least during my mother's life. And to this day, my brother doesn't remember coming home after this ET contact and having this helicopter virtually put its skids on the top cornice of our house. Now, I want to make it clear that we are being visited by extraterrestrials, and I know that we are because I've carried out my investigation so much that I've even been able to recover the name of the FBI agent who was the younger of 2 FBI agents who interviewed me about my contacts with the small grays when I was in kindergarten in 1966-67. I entered kindergarten as a 4-year-old, and I was still 5 by the time I graduated from kindergarten to go on to the 1st grade. And I've been able to spend so many years investigating my ET contact experiences and my dad's work on the ET project that goes back to, as I said, to October of 1952, 3 months after the famous July 1952 overflight of Washington, D.C., that I can tell you that the name of the younger FBI agent who interviewed me in 1967, Richard Bauer Sr. I have spoken to his son, Richard Bauer Jr. of Malibu, California, And Richie sent me a picture of his father. And I said, that's the guy who was the younger guy who interviewed me when I was in kindergarten about my contacts with the Greys. Now, the gentleman who interviewed me about the abduction with my brother on Columbus Day of 1967, when I was in the first grade that I just described, where we were taken aboard the craft and fed this weird kind of gelatinous fruit like candy, and it produced euphoria. I've been able to locate his name. His name was Dr. Joseph Humer, and he ultimately became principal of our elementary school, Mount View Road School. So I know that we're being contacted, and I've been able, in the experiencer side of the duality of all this, I've been able to identify the names of some of the federal agents who investigated my experiences. And here's one of the weird synchronous things that happened about that abduction that I just mentioned. When I was editing the Fatima trilogy, Anomalous Books, the second book was called Celestial Secrets, The Hidden History of the Mystery of Fatima. I believe it was in that book or the earlier book, Heavenly Lights, where a pseudonymous story of two brothers called the Steiner brothers was described. And I realized as I was editing this book and translating it with my friend Eva Thompson and my friend Alexander Bruce from Portuguese, that trilogy from Portuguese into English, to bring the work of the two Portuguese historians who were appointed by the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican, to have access to the Fatima Sanctuary Archive. They were the leading experts on the Fatima incident of 1917 in the world, and I was responsible for working with Joaquin Fernandez just from one email. And ultimately that was a project that involved 35 people from 10 countries, ultimately contributed in some way to that trilogy in English. But anyway, that trilogy told the story pseudonymously of the Steiner brothers, and as I was reading it while we were editing those books and translating them into English and sort of rewriting them so that we could publish them in English, I said, my God, this is the case involving my brother and I. And because we had been, at least I had been interviewed by this gentleman, Dr. Joseph Humer, after he hypnotized me with a pocket watch a couple days after the incident. He said, I want to ask you what happened to you and your brother on the school grounds. So the point I'd like to make to Chuck is to keep an open mind in the sense that I know as a lawyer educated at UCLA and Cambridge, and as the son of one of the American engineers who was literally designing the aircraft to chase the ETs out of our atmosphere, and as an investigator who has actually identified the names of several of the federal investigators who interviewed me in childhood about my ET contact experiences, that we are being contacted by extraterrestrials. But there is this strange duality where one friend will see it and one won't. Two friends or two siblings will remember it, won't. And what I found with the Lac Rapide case that I was involved in, which was the most dramatic one that I was involved in, and the one that was sort of most intrusive and most involving a frightening medical abduction, is that over the last almost 50 years, in 2022, it will be 50 years since 1972 and the summer that abduction occurred. Every time I took that experience to my late father and my late mother and all four of my siblings, they strenuously avoided discussing the matter. It was, I dare say that it was almost as if they were programmed to forget. So I just want to make the point with Chuck that the ETs are very advanced, and I think it's quite possible that when we consider the fact that 3 of the Allagash 4 are fairly certain, at least one remembered, and then his brother remembered, and then a third remembered, but that Chuck thinks it may have been fanciful. If I'm to understand what he's saying, he thinks their story may be fanciful or imaginative. I think it's possible that it just registers in the human mind in different ways based on the inherent character and personality and brain structure of the experiencer. I think that the Allagash Four were all abducted, and that, like my siblings, Chuck was left in a condition by the ETs where he was just didn't want to explore what happened. Because, like I said, every time I brought up that abduction in Canada with all 6 of my relatives, they strenuously avoided the discussion. And I would say, I wasn't carsick on the way home. It must have been radiation sickness, and they just didn't want to hear it.
Their operating egos could not take the revealing of that material. It was just too deeply hidden for them. But I love what you're saying, that we're all grasping the reality from different directions of this elephant that we're trying to figure out. And I think it's great to entertain every single perspective. But one of the things, if something happened and you don't remember, that means your protective selves, especially Chuck, your very powerful intellectual and scientific part that's committed to 3D reality, and is not going to let any material come that's going to overwhelm him. Everybody does that, and it's cool. However, these guys said stuff, and it went into your mind, and at least you can make a hypothesis about what they made up and why they made that up, and not just in terms of the motives of fame and everything, but in terms of the content of what they said.
Well, I think that what they said was certainly imaginative, because this is the history they'd had in the past. They'd taken a lot of LSD. They'd gone to Woodstock, and from what I know about LSD, it does things to your brain in order to change your structure or your brain. And I just believe that the thing didn't want to have anything to do with us after the ETs saw that we were panicking. So I very much wanted something to happen, because I was very curious, and certainly sat there with the paddle in my lap, and I felt like I was inviting them to come have something to do with us, but that they were responding to the panic. So that's how I feel about it. I think what Andy is saying is really interesting. It's certainly a hypothesis. Maybe the ETs are manipulating us. I certainly think that there's a lot of contact going on with the ETs, but I don't feel part of it. Wish I did, but from what I can see, especially with the fire, that they exaggerated greatly the size of the logs. I am the one that cut the logs, and they claim that they were 12 inches in diameter, and I know for a fact that the biggest log was maybe 3 inches in diameter, and it was all bleached driftwood. It burned up quickly, and so there was no missing time. The fire burned down very predictably, and I just don't see any time that was lost at all.
If I might interject, Sasha, there's a catchphrase I've kind of developed that I think is material when we're talking about extraterrestrials. I like to say that we're not being visited by extraterrestrials in spaceships. We're being visited by interdimensionals in time ships. So, for example, I was having contact with the small grays throughout childhood, and my siblings would seldom even wake up. So I think that what may cause this duality is that these are not biological beings that are in the here and now in the way that we are. I think that they're interdimensionals that are time traveling here, and they're here in sort of interstitial chasms in time-space, the very chasms that Project Pegasus was accessing when I was a child on the project. And I think, as I said, that's why maybe I had so much contact going back to, and I've really avoided the discussion of this primarily because every time that I included the extraterrestrial experiences in childhood, people would readily jump to the conclusion, oh, I get it. You were exposed to time travel devices that were reverse engineered from the aliens. And I wanted to make it clear that most of our time travel arsenal owed its greatest debt of gratitude actually to Nikola Tesla. So I have avoided discussing my ET contact experiences, but I've started to call them IDs or interdimensionals rather than ETs or extraterrestrials, because I think the government has known for years, and I think what I experienced were beings that are interdimensionals visiting us in time ships, not extraterrestrials visiting us in so-called spaceships. And in that sense, they may not be coming from way out there, which of course would take millions of light years to get here. I think they're probably dropping down from a higher level of universal order sort of above us. In other words, they're using their ships to drop down into our dimension from their dimension, where they may be very close to us. And I once asked one of the short grays that were visiting me in childhood where they were from, and he pointed to space in a very small, in a way that indicated to me that he didn't mean that far away from our planet. So I think we really have not yet defined what this experience is, but I do respect Chuck's position and his experiences just because that's what he remembers, and we have to be honest. But I must state that I've received similar statements from some of my siblings about my time travel experiences where they've said, oh, come on, you've talked about ET contacts happening in our household in New Jersey. And you know what? They did. I was interviewed about them by federal agents whose names I've been able to recover. And who, in the case of Richard Bauer Sr., I learned that from his son Richard Bauer Jr., that he committed suicide at age 63 by shooting himself with his handgun in his car in Los Angeles, California, after he and his wife having his picture taken with President and Nancy Reagan. So, I mean, I've really taken my investigation of what happened to me to the point of finding the federal agents who interviewed me, and I know that my experiences happened because I recounted them under hypnosis. I remembered them years later, and I never forgot them. But I do think that, it's interesting how the Allagash 4 case, I think, reveals something that is part and parcel of many ET contact experiences, and it's as if some people are taken into another dimension where the contact occurs, and some of the people that they're with will see the craft, the time ship, as it were, but then not be taken. So there's literally, and when I consider how far down the road I've gone in even finding the names of some of the federal investigators who questioned me about my so-called ET contact experiences, it's almost as if we live in different worlds. Because some of my siblings who can't remember these things happening in our household doubt that I'm telling the truth. And I've just pretty much given up wanting to be believed about my non-ordinary experiences, whether it was my 4 years of service in Project Pegasus, whether it was my 4 years of service when I was in college going to Mars for the CIA under a program directed by a Howard Hughes, who was still very much alive, even though supposedly he became demented and diminished and died in 1976, when in fact a general for the Air Force has proven, Mark Music has proven, that I could have met Hughes in the 1980s because Howard Hughes actually died in 2001. So I guess what I've come to learn is that in the same way that allegations of crimes will often be completely discrepant among siblings, for example, who grew up with each other, when they witness a crime or molestation is occurring or something like that, in the same way, those of us who are experiencers earnestly want to be believed, but I've given up because I really feel that it's like we're all living in different realities. I mean, and when you think about it, Buckminster Fuller said that we all live in semi-overlapping realities. Think about when you're in college, when you're talking to a friend, and then another friend joins you, and then that first friend walks to their next class. Is it really true that all three of you went to the same college? Well, you were at the same college at the same time, but you literally had different college experiences because we all occupy different locations and different times in space, in time-space.
Yeah.
So that's what I think is going on, is that...
Yeah, I think that, space-time is merely our intellectual grasp of something which is nothing but a hypothetical set of constructs that help us deal with stuff. And so the reality is the singularity of you and every other fractal in the universe is available. And what happens, as Chuck said, like with people that take LSD or meditate a lot, you realize that the reality that we're in now, this 3D reality, is also just an aspect or a dimension. People like Russell Brininger talk about when they have a near-death experience, they see their future self, they see their, it's like... once we allow all these different dimensions into our consciousness, we have such an amazing, richer world. And all we can do, I think, Andy, is to invite people to join us. You have something else special, though, I want to say, is you've got a paper trail. You gave speeches. You took notes. You took, so you've got pieces of paper that you typed at different times that can be dated. You've got all that kind of stuff, and that's very powerful too.
Right, and I've written a trilogy now, and the second book in the trilogy is my ET contact experiences, but I've come to, really in the last 2 years since I had my vision problems, I've really begun to think about how mysterious life actually is. For I realized, as I was just dealing with my crisis, that I lost 7 of my junior high school friends. They were all male, and they all died before we reached high school graduation. You think of elderly people passing away, but I just took stock of the fact that I lost 7 of my junior high school classmates, all male, from different causes: car accidents, drug overdoses, cancer, falling, drowning. And I just can't really believe it that if you had asked me in the 7th grade at Lawrence Junior High School in Chatsworth, California, whether 7 people in my school annual would not be around because they would be dead by the time we graduated from high school, I wouldn't have believed it. But I'm really starting to get a sense that life is far stranger than we allow it. But at the same time, I realize that it seems to be a minority of people who relate to experiencers. I think that many people are experiencers, but I don't think we know why some people are experiencers and some are not. I'm leaning towards the possibility that the experiencers are simply people who have a personality, and this indeed may have been why I was selected for government service at such a young age, who can sort of look something right in the face and not flinch, and then remember what happened. I've always been that kind of person. And I think those who have supported my work have sensed that. I was always able to just look at something and say to an adult, no, this is what happened. Bam, ba-bam, ba-bam, and not flinch and not start crying and not wet my pants. I was able to buck up and deal with pretty severe stress as a kid. And in fact, in Project Pegasus, I was the captain of Blue Team. And one time when we teleported from New Jersey to New Mexico, it was not 1971 when we went there, it was 1991. So I've had virtually every kind of experiencer type of experience one can have. I mean, I had contact with ghosts, ETs. I met 2 Sasquatch when we were camping at Great Lake Sagandaga in the Adirondacks of New York State when I was a very small child, when I was about 4.5 or almost 5 in the summer of '66, 6 years before this contact with the Greys in Canada. So I just think that I've had to accept the fact that I'm an experiencer, and I tell what happened to me calmly and clearly, but I've let go of any desire that I be believed, because I know that for some people, experiencer stories like this just do not relate or correlate to their realities. And I just have to let it go and not expect to be believed by everybody. But like I said, I respect the mission, you know.
That's it. Just that's it. You don't waste your life force with trolls.
Right.
Well, or even well-meaning people who say, I simply don't believe that. I mean, Cliff High believes that I'm delusional about my time travel experiences because he reductio ad absurdum. He first concludes that time travel is impossible, so he then extrapolates and says, so Andy must be lying or delusional. The problem is, I know what I experienced. My dad and I were working with Manhattan Project physicists like Dr. Harold Agnew, Dr. Edward Teller, and Dr. Sterling Colgate. We also met Emilio Segre of the Manhattan Project one day when we were at Lanel after teleporting to New Mexico. So I know what I experienced, and that was time travel. Because the very individuals who designed the atom bomb were working on time travel when they were working on the bomb in the 40s. And so there's nothing I can say to a Cliff High. I don't want to say, Cliff High, you lie, but he doesn't believe time travel is possible when, in fact, I know the very leading physicists in the country that we were working with. And then I go on.
We just have to forgive him. He's frightened. You just have to forgive him, Andy.
On William Shatner's show, and he makes up the myth that I said that the teleporter we were working with, my father designed at our garage in Morris Plains, New Jersey, when in fact he was consulting with Harold Agnew of Lanel, the very single individual who during World War II was trusted to take the nuclear trigger from the island of Tinian in the South Pacific to be placed aboard the atom bomb that was placed aboard the Enola Gay. So when you can't convince intelligent people like Cliff High that you're telling the truth because you worked with leading physicists in the country, I don't know what else we can do. I mean, we can't often offer documents, so I think it's important that we just tell our stories so that in several generations the world will know that, yes, time travel exists. Yes, we first went to Mars in 1964, 5 years before the so-called lunar landing. And yes, Sasquatch exists. Our great-grandparents knew it existed. They used to call them boogers or bogeyman. And that ETs have been contacting and abducting some of us, but at the same time, those who seem somewhat implicated in the contacts, like Chuck, sometimes have no extraordinary memories of what happened. And I just think that has to be respected as part of, like I said, the duality of ET contact.
Yeah. Janet? Are you guys still there? Am I off the air?
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. I muted instead of unmuting. Okay, so sorry. I just wanted to add just to interject in here. So Andy, earlier you were saying that you thought they were interdimensional, but I've interviewed hundreds of experiencers, and there's a lot of evidence that it is extraterrestrial, but their technologies are way beyond what humans have, and at the same time we're catching up because we're reverse engineering.
Well, I don't believe Alex Collier's claim that we know where they're from, because I was asked as a kid to find out who they were, where they were from, and what they wanted. So how would he know that a specific group of aliens is from Andromeda, and another group from Aldebaran, and another group?
A lot of them try to fill in the blanks for us when we ask where they're from, and they'll give us a reference that we're familiar with or something. So I think they're from all over. I don't think they're from one place.
Exactly.
I've had experiences with 100,000 unique species, and when I was there, they said, this is but a small fraction of the beings that exist in this.
And my point is, Janet, is even the reticuli was derived by Marjorie Fish from the star map that she made from Betty Hill of the Betty and Barney Hill abduction. That was under hypnosis. So there was nothing. My point is, there was no categorical scientific finding that the grays are from Zeta Reticuli, and we've been calling them Zetas. It's theorized that they may be from Zeta Reticuli, but we don't know.
Yeah.
You know, that all of them are.
Just need to have something to wrap their minds around because we're used to beings being from somewhere and, you know, having a name. So that's our humans need.
In fact, let me mention that
they fill in the gaps for us and they humor us.
One day when I was in New Mexico in 71 or 72 with my father, who, as I said, was a trained observer of foreign and domestic conventional craft and of ET craft, because he was working on the counterforce to build the craft like the ramjet to chase them out of our atmosphere. I asked them, why are they visiting me? And he said, we don't know. And he said with his voice quaking, we don't know where they're from or what they want. And he was talking about tall grays that were even in liaison with the government. So in other words, the reality is one in which our government had tall grays as guests in New Mexico and still didn't know where they were from, what they were, or what they wanted. They knew they were clearly not from Earth and not human, but they didn't know precisely where they had come from. And there was a lot of effort to try to interview them and find out where they were from. So I'm just saying that we're really at the embryonic stage in figuring out what's been going on.
And
that's why I feel obligated to start talking about experiences more frequently.
That's why many times the militaries will take a contactee after they have an abduction experience to see if they can get information from them about which species and where they're from. And so, you know, they have a lot of holes in their information, but they know a lot more than they're revealing as well. Apparently we have treaties with different species, and, you know, and your father obviously had information, but he didn't have all the information. He's been dead a long time now, and there's a lot more that's happened since then. So we're in this mystery, but hopefully we could someday have disclosure, and I hope, Andy, that you're the disclosure president. So I'm looking forward to you running in 2024.
Elected, I will serve. But I really feel obligated to talk about my my ET contact experiences. I kept it back because I didn't want to sort of vitiate my description of my other experiences. But I really feel that life is short. You know, I'm 57 now, and I've written books about these experiences just because they did happen, and I feel obligated to inform my civilization that this has been going on. And I don't think we should flinch. I really think we should start confronting the issue head on and trying to tease out comparisons that will reveal what attracts them and who they are, which ones they are, and where they were active. And like I said, I just still, after listening to Chuck, and every time I hear about the Allagash case, I suspect it was the same beings that picked me up at Lac Rapide in 1972. I just have a gut instinct.
So tell us a little bit more about the beings that you encountered. I did stop you. So you said, we come in peace. Then what happened?
Well, I held up my right hand, palm forward, and said, I come in peace. Because I didn't know what to say, because my 6 relatives were frozen behind me and were not moving. And I didn't know whether they were going to unfreeze. And there are these 4 advanced beings, these tall grays, sitting down right in front of me. I'm, 10 feet away, 5 feet away. And then I remember sort of blacking out or slipping into unconsciousness, the kind of way that we do when we undergo surgery. I just kind of eased into an unconscious state, and I woke up aboard their craft, and I was on in a very Spartan medical examining room, and there were 3 or 4 tall grays there, one of them female who was standing next to me, And I started panicking, getting up from the bed, from the platform, like bed, saying, let me out of here, let me out of here. You don't have a right to take me. And they said things like, yes, we do. Calm down. We're not going to hurt you. And then they strapped me down by the wrists and ankles and injected a hypodermic needle into my eyes. And I really freaked out, and I actually calmed down so that I wouldn't hurt myself on the needles. I was smart enough to know that if I moved around while they were injecting something into me, I could snap off the needle, and I didn't want to snap off the hypodermic needle in my eyes. So I just laid there and let them stick the needle into my eyes. And it hurt a little bit, but not much, not very much. In fact, I've had injections in my eyes in adulthood, and they haven't hurt at all. So it didn't hurt as much as I thought it was going to. But I was really panicking and thrashing around, and the female gray was saying, calm down, we're not going to hurt you, we're going to release you pretty soon, just be calm, and we're going to let you go. And then after that, I noticed that, like I said, that the craft seemed to be farther to the left and much larger inside than it had been when I was standing there on the side of their craft. And then all seven of us woke up around the campfire, and there were just the minimal amount of embers left in the fireplace. There was no fire. It was just smoking embers because my dad had kicked the fire out. It was a roaring fire we had going. Another similarity when I was listening to Chuck was that my dad had sent me down to get driftwood on the shore of Lac Rapide earlier that day to stoke a fire, and we had a raging fire. It was really warm. That's why I was sitting to the right and maybe a half step back in my lawn chair than my older family members, and that's why I was able to get up easiest and run down towards the beach when we saw what we thought was the helicopter, and then run back after I saw that it was a lenticular craft coming towards our location. So that's all I remember is being injected in the eyes and then released. Maybe, who knows, maybe they're so smart that they saw me in adulthood during my period of legal blindness when my brother or my girlfriend had been helping me, get in and out of a car to go to one of my medical appointments for my ophthalmological treatments, and wondered what's going on with this guy? What's wrong with his eyes? I did end up with eyes that are relatively small relative to the size of my head. So maybe there was something anomalous about my morphology that they wanted to study. I don't know. I would not predispose to know what the ETs are studying. I think they're just cosmic scientists who are checking us out biologically, like we tag and investigate and then release animals, but I don't know. They certainly didn't do anything gratuitous to hurt me. They did keep their word. They quickly released me because I then woke up around the campfire. How they got the six of my family members out of that paralysis and then situated me and them around the fire is an absolute mystery. But there was certainly enough remoteness in Lac Rapide at that time of the summer for them to have landed there and walked around the campsite and arranged it without being seen by other campers. It was a really remote camping experience, like I said. And I'm amazed, my dad let us go that far into the boonies, because if any of us had gotten an appendicitis, we might have not been able to get treatment. We might have perished. It was really a risky trip. And, there was one time when he charged a bear to chase it away from our campsite. So, I lived a pretty rugged life there under my dad's tutelage, and I wouldn't have missed it for the world. I had great adventures like that as a kid. But my other family members will not talk about that experience. I think one of them said no.
That seems to be an indicator when people don't want to talk about it, that there may have been more that they don't want to go into.
And yet, I had
otherwise
conversations.
They would talk about it.
I had conversations with my dad throughout his life about his work on the ET project going back to 1952, And I'm fairly sure that my 4 older siblings who are all still alive, although I've lost my beloved parents, they've gone over to the other side. But I don't think my 4 older siblings really know that my father never worked in conventional engineering for Parsons. He worked on time travel and on jet aircraft to chase the ETs out of ours in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And there was nothing ordinary about his career. And I do think that I'm another reason I feel motivated to talk about these experiences in my dad's work is I think that time will tell that my dad was an American hero, because he was designing the craft to chase the ETs out of our atmosphere because they did not have our permission to hover above our nation's capital in the way that they did.
Do you have his notes? Is there a way that you can access diary?
I have his from Lehigh. His undergraduate education was 50% electrical engineering, 25% mathematics, and 25% physics. Very much like John G. Trump, the uncle of President Trump. And like him, he wasn't
out of time, everybody.
A time traveler.
Thank you so much for coming on today. Love and blessings. Aloha. We'll have to do this again soon. It was fun. Aloha.
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Syndicalist commune. We take it in turns to act as a sort of executive officer for the week. Yes. But all the decisions of that officer have to be ratified at a special bi-weekly meeting. Yes, I see. By a civil majority in the case of purely internal affairs. Be quiet. But by a 2/3 majority in the case of more... Be quiet. I order you to be quiet. Look, you stupid bastard, you've got no arms left. Yes, I have. Look. It's just a flesh wound.
I don't believe I've seen such a display of courage, skill, nerve, grace, stupidity.
I'll do you for that. Oh, what? Come here. What are you going to do, bleed on me? I'm invincible. You're a loony. The Black Knight always triumphs.
Roundtable Live Monday through Friday, 1 a.m. till 4 a.m. Eastern Time. Bring your mind, bring your ideas, bring your voice. King Arthur had nothing on us here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com.
Most guys freeze. That's your cerebral cortex looking for an answer it doesn't have.
See? Even your brain knows you're screwed.
The body's filling with adrenaline right now, whether you know it or not. Your heart's beating fast. It's getting a little harder to breathe. The neurobiological system is telling it to run, but your knees are too weak to move.
Fear is not real. The only place that fear can exist is in our thoughts of the future. It is a product of our imagination, causing us to fear things that do not at present and may not ever exist. That is near insanity. Do not misunderstand me. Danger is very real, but fear is a choice. We are all telling ourselves a story.
You're listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. 100% listener-supported radio. Reporting the danger. Unafraid. Right here, where information never sleeps. Revolution Radio.
original machine had a base plate of prefamulated amulite, surmounted by a malleable logarithmic casing, in such a way that the two spurving bearings were in a direct line with the